Hi, everyone. It's Tahara Ezrahti here with Applied Intuition, and I'm a clairvoyant and clairvoyant development teacher. And today I'm here with Shannon Jaffe, and Shannon is an artist and also an art teacher. Currently, she's working with elementary students in the public schools. And today we're going to talk about your brain on creativity and some connections between meditation, accessing your intuition, accessing your creativity, how it's useful in all parts of your life, and how working with students really can help them develop neural pathways that can serve them, ongoing into their adulthood. So welcome, Shannon, and your kitty there.
Yes.
So Shannon, we had talked before, and we were talking about art as essential and how art can help people heal, both spiritually, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But today we wanted to talk about your brain on creativity. And so I wanted to start off by asking you about different brainwave states. We talked a little bit last time about alpha brainwave state, but can you explain a little bit more about what beta brainwaves are and alpha brainwaves and how that's relevant to teaching art?
Sure. Um, a little disclaimer, I'm not an expert in brainwaves, but I do know through researching the brain and how it works when someone is creative that there are so many different parts of your brain that are working together when one is being creative, something like 40 plus parts of the brain. It's a bit of a myth that it's the right brain versus the left brain. It's a very complex system. So our brain, when we're in a beta state, is when we're more in the prefrontal cortex thinking, consciously making decisions. And then when we are in the alpha state, is when we are in a more relaxed state. And that's where people are when they're being creative. For the most part, they're experiencing alpha brain waves.
Okay. And you had mentioned earlier about this myth that people are just born with the creative, like they're just born creative or not creative, that people will say, I didn't get the creative gene. And we talked about how that's really not accurate. And you had mentioned to me about these different modes that we go into and how we can develop those. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So people can the genes in the brain can be a small biological advantage for somebody who's creative, but anyone can be creative. Everyone is creative. If you think about every day that we're making decisions on, like we talked about, like what you're going to wear, or what your bedroom's going to look like, or what you're having for dinner. So those are all creative decisions that people make every day. Um, but people who tend to be more creative, highly creative people, um, they often have personality traits that make them more creative. For example, like their willingness to take risks, or being open to new things. So you can be trained and you can be taught how to be creative.
I think that's really relevant. I relate to that a lot as an intuitive teacher and meditation teacher, where people will say, oh, I just can't meditate. It's like, well, you know what? No one ever taught you how to do it in a way that you can calm your brain. And so I get what you're talking about with beta brain waves, or people are in the front of their head. It's an analytical function. It's good for math and for reading and doing your taxes and like really figuring things out. And you can even see people kind of scrunching their forehead a little bit when they're thinking really hard. There's that famous statue of the thinker, and he's got his hand, to his front of his head. His hand's not like here or on top or in the back, right? It's like right there, which is that analytical mode and beta. And in my experience, and you can look at different brainwave frequencies, different hertz per second, that beta is the fastest. It's in the front of your head. As you move your attention a little farther back, you're in alpha, which is that zone where it's kind of relaxed but alert. So it's good for music, art, sports, or just kind of your body's calm and your mind's awake, but you're not thinking a million miles a minute, and it's not difficult. And you're aware of like a full body. I think that's the difference. You're not just in your head, your whole body is engaged. And then as you move a little farther back, you move into more of a deep meditation, which is theta, which is even slower. And then farther back, is delta. So when I teach people to meditate, I just coach them to bring their attention into the middle of their head, and that automatically slows their brainwaves down into a state where they're more creative and they can access their intuition. And so, how do you get your students to access their creativity and get out of a faster beta brainwave that maybe they've been in all morning because they're doing their other studies into more of an alpha state where they can do art? What are some of the tools you use to do that?
Well, first, we talk about the fact that every human is creative, and we talk about that creativity is a skill. Like we were just saying, it's a skill, like listening, that you can learn and you can be taught that. So when I'm working with my students, I we always start our classes off with 10 deep breaths, and
Hmm.
it's something that we have always done, will always do, because that is a very quick and easy way to get the body in the alpha state, when students are relaxed and some of them choose to close their eyes and they take 10 deep breaths, and it's amazing how transformative just those 10 deep breaths can be. I've actually have done quite a bit of research with my students, and time again, it shows that students are more relaxed and ready to be creative after they have done deep breathing. So that's one way. Sometimes we'll do some meditations. I Most of my students can meditate for at least 6 minutes or more, which is pretty impressive for
Yeah.
second grade and up, and even some of my kindergartners. So that's another way that we can enter the alpha state. And visualizations. We do visualizations quite often with projects where they close their eyes and visualize what they want to do, what they want to create. So that's another powerful way. Um, Calming music is also another way that works. When we do art, we often play music that's calming, Native American flute music, sometimes African drumming, all types of different music. But I don't have lyrics with the music. And I find that just my choice in materials, natural materials, when I can use natural materials, or when I can take my students out in nature, that also has a very calming effect. So those are some of the ways that um, I help my students to access the alpha
So
state.
you help them come from, busy recess or busy math class or whatever, and just switch gears into this other mode. How did you learn how to do that? How did you learn to switch them into this other mode with these tools you just mentioned?
Well, from day one, where I started teaching art, I was doing yoga and deep breathing. And so I just took that tool that worked so well for me and implemented that into my class, and actually have never taught an art class for the last 16 years without starting with deep breathing. And it's
Wow.
just been such an easy tool where students can just access that calm state. And it's it lowers the affective filter, I think, for my students too, because this is something that doesn't require anything. Everyone is breathing all the time. So the deep breathing is something that they feel comfortable with. They don't have to
Okay.
read anything or say anything or uh, do anything or learn anything. So they feel emotionally in a safe space.
That's so great. I never thought about that, but they don't have to have any anxiety about that. That the first thing you're asking them to do, everyone, no matter if they're a special ed kid or whatever their other skills or weaknesses, they all can take 10 deep breaths. Okay. So, you also had talked about how experimenting is very important and just playing with materials without jumping from, okay, now we're going to start and we're going to make this, and then it has to come out a certain way. So, you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the value of experimenting, and if you have any other visuals you want to show us, go ahead and do that too.
Sure. Would you like me to share my screen right now?
Sure, if you want to, if you're ready to.
So I'll go ahead and do that
Do you
first.
always let the kids have an opportunity to experiment before they jump into actually making something?
I do. I always do. Again, it lowers the affective filter where students feel that they can become comfortable with the material.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so they feel uh, that they don't have to, create something right away, that they can learn how to manipulate, say, for example, clay. And that's really the most important part of a lesson for me and for my students, is when they get that time to disconnect from the world and just work in a material with no expectations. So that to me is the prime time for them to get from the beta brainwaves, which we see here in this a simple graph example, to the alpha. So they can daydream, they can relax, they can, um, like I said, disconnect from thinking and get into that flow state. I have some slides here. I spoke about materials. So I love working with natural materials for students. It's just so calming when they have natural materials as opposed to plastic and bright colors. I mean, this is art, so we use a lot of color, but also it's really calming for them to have neutral colors and natural materials. So you can see here, students are gathering some rocks for experimentation purposes for um, rock sculpture. And the only guiding principle I had here for this project was balance. And how do you balance something
Mm.
and create a balance? And so that's what we were working with. But they experimented first before we even ever talked about balance. Choice is another way that I like to give students a lot of options and materials that lend themselves to experimentation. So you can see this person is made it their self-portrait using a lot of different things: screws, wood, drawings, um, keys. So uh, choices in making art, I think, are really important and lend to experimentation really well. We spoke about nature, just having students be outside when possible or out on the patio in the art room, just fresh air and nature, just another way to get them into that alpha state.
Can I make a comment about that? So, one of the other things that exists is there's something called the Schumann resonance, and the Schumann resonance is the background frequency of the Earth, and it's about 7.83 hertz per second. It varies, but that's kind of the average. And so when people's brain waves are at that 7.8 approximately hertz, it's easier for them to be grounded and to be connected with the earth, and that is naturally this alpha state going into theta. So for a lot of people, going outside is helpful because they're matching. It's easier to match the energy of the earth when you're surrounded with rocks and grass and trees and so forth. And so I can see how just going outside can help them access more of that creative alpha brainwave state and get out of this faster beta state.
Yes, that makes perfect sense to me. Um, yes, so I have been functioning on that in a more intuitive way, but hearing you speak about that really resonates with me. So thank you for explaining that. That's really interesting. So gathering natural materials is another way. I love experimenting with students. Here you see a student. We gathered flowers from the garden at school, and they laid them out in a pattern, and then they used hammers to hammer the flowers into the cotton fabric, using the natural ink from the flowers to create a pattern. And from there, we did some sewing and embroidery. But the first phase was all about experimenting with the flowers and the ink and the patterns and the dye. And again, there was just a lot of calmness, honestly, a lot of students who were engaged and relaxed.
And I can see how this project, again, you talked about the what you call the
The affective filter.
affective filter, where that's not an intimidating assignment. Go pick some flowers, put it in this piece of cloth and hammer it. That I can
Exactly.
imagine the kids aren't going to freak out like, I can't do that. I'm not good at that.
Everyone could do it.
Yeah.
Everyone was engaged and excited. So let's see. Moving on. There we go. We took the concept of peace and we spoke about peace and what that means, what that feels like, what that looks like at our school, in our community, and in the world. And students chose peace symbols to embroider onto their flowers. And we talked about functional art. We made these embroidery pieces into pillows. And those were a lot of complex skills. And we put them together. So you can see we don't stay in the experimentation phase forever. We take that and we use it to create art.
Cool.
This is a student experimenting with clay. I usually tell them they can do whatever they want with the clay except for throw it. I mean, they could throw it at some point, but not in the classroom.
Do you find that most kids, especially the little ones, the kindergartners coming in, have they had a lot of time experimenting with Play-Doh and those types of things, or has that kind of gone by the wayside since computers and iPads and phones and things have become a toy that kids play with? Are they lacking access to Play-Doh and clay?
Well, many of my students have not had experiences with clay. Um, Most of them, actually, some of them have, and it varies. It varies from year to year, grade to grade. But there are, so many students who have not had experiences with clay. And even the students who have had experiences with clay, they often have not had time to experiment. So it is a really important part. I mean, some students clearly have had that opportunity, but for the most part, no, they haven't had a lot of time, at least in school, to experiment. In fact, they often ask me and look at me, you mean we can do whatever we want? And this is in the very early grades, because
Mhm.
after several months, they get it. They know they're going to have time to experiment with whatever materials we're using. But I can't say that it is common for them to have time to experiment.
Hmm. When I was growing up, everyone played with clay and Play-Doh and mud. It was just that's what kids did. But I was just kind of wondering if that has lessened since there's so many electronics available. And beads. We played with beads too. That was just part of what you did as a kindergartner.
Yeah, I've noticed that my students love to bead, and wire is a great tool for beading because they can bend it, they can twist it. Again, really good with fine motor skills. And it's a great way to get into the alpha state because it's very calming. And there's a challenge, the challenge to put the beads on the wire. And so beading is a great tool for that. Painting, also another beautiful way to get into the alpha state. You see here students just painting whatever they want with whatever colors they want, and totally engaged. This is wood and glue guns. I love to use glue guns. I have student glue guns. They don't get hot, too hot for students. And even my first graders can use them. And this is uh, Tower Town here, where students come in at lunch and recess and just experiment with wood, cork, popsicle sticks, and glue guns. And they make some really incredible creations. This one was ongoing with some sixth graders, which is pretty amazing when you can have sixth graders come into the art room and spend all their lunches and recesses working on one project. And that's what happened here over the course of, say, about 3 months. And they
Wow.
were basically experimenting with how to use a glue gun, how to use the wood, and they created an amazing sculpture.
So it's interesting that it's multiple kids making this project. Do they argue, say, no, don't put that there? Or do they each take a little section? How does it work with them working together with something that's not really planned?
Well, the collaboration piece is a piece I love about this, is that they come in voluntarily and gather their friends, and they have times where they're not seeing eye to eye, but they work through it. And you always have someone who's kind of the leader, they're leading the group, and someone who's gathering the materials and someone who's doing the work. So it definitely changes, for whoever's doing it. Each student has a different task, but ultimately they come to agreement.
And how do they know when they're done?
That's a really good question. I think that's one of the most challenging questions for most artists, is when are they done? And
Right.
yeah, so that's a great learning moment, is to ask them, so when do you think you are done? And have them think about that.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a good question. This is wood. Students just experimenting in different types of woods, and eventually I bring out the wood glue, but first it's just wood, nothing else. And you can see, hopefully you can sense that even though their faces aren't in this picture, these students are intently concentrating into that alpha brain state, where they are focused and relaxed and creative and very intentional about what they're doing.
Do you feel like there's a quiet that comes over the room when they're all in this state?
Absolutely. It does get quiet. And sometimes it's not totally quiet if they're working, like these two girls are working together. So they might be talking, but it's not like, loud and crazy, although it does get loud and crazy sometimes.
There's, from in my experience, there's a certain peacefulness that comes over the room, even if people are talking or moving. It's not frenetic. It's a intentional. I don't know. It's peaceful state.
Yes, absolutely. It is so peaceful when they're doing any of these projects where they're experimenting. Even if they are talking, it's a very peaceful place. And sometimes people ask me, how do you have your students so engaged? Well, honestly, the experimentation phase is a place where students always are engaged, because they are doing what they want to do. They're making mistakes, they're learning, they're taking chances, they're risk taking, they're doing all those traits that people with uh, that are super creative use, and they're learning them, and it's intuitive. And then eventually with time they get to a point where I give them a challenge, and that also supports their creativity.
Hmm.
So I'll stop my share right
Cool.
now.
Well, I think it's so fascinating that having art in school, it allows them to develop this other part of their brain that otherwise probably wouldn't get exercised. And that especially as they're growing, those neural pathways get developed and they can use that for everything moving forward, into adulthood. I used to work at Art from Scrap, and it was a similar thing. And I could always tell the kids who had access to art classes, because they would just immediately start, they knew what to do. They knew how to approach a project. And then you take that and you think, okay, so now you're 30 or you're 40 and you're in a company. How do you approach a project? And people who know how to do that and who know how to do even complex projects. So I love the flowers on the cloth. That's very simple, but then it got more complex. And now find a peace symbol and embroider that and then make a pillow out of it. That if you apply that to a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old, that is, putting together some kind of big project, a 6-month work project or something like that. And I think that having children experience starting with the different elements and then bringing it together into more and more complexity teaches them how to do that, and also builds the confidence in them, because it can feel overwhelming if you told the kids, okay, we're going to make peace pillows and you're going to have to embroider and sew and come up with a design and dye the fabric. They might be like, what? We can't do that. But if you just start them off with the simplest things that it's almost like you lead them into the project in a very safe way.
I actually did not have a plan for that project. That project developed on its own. The students were the ones who guided that project. And so it just developed on its own, from the flowers to the conversation about peace, and then choosing to do symbols, and then sewing, and what were we going to do with them, and oh, let's make them into pillows. So it did happen very organically, which was another a nice part of that, about that.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think like you mentioned, instilling these skills into our students is super important. It's so important, and they can learn. They can learn the different traits that uh, cultivate creativity. Some things that we talk about in the classroom are being able to see two different ideas, two different perspectives, and how creative people are able to do that. That creative people are serious about their hobbies, the hobbies that they do outside of school, and those are inspiring, and help support creativity. And like you said, help support self-confidence. So having multiple perspectives, taking your hobbies seriously, all those things support creativity. And also, another thing that we do talk about is how attitude is so important when you're being creative, and having the attitude that you can be creative. It's more important than but if it's between intelligence and attitude. When you're being creative, the attitude is going to support your creativity
Mm-hmm.
every day, taking chances and experimenting. And finally, we talk about having a sense of humor, about not taking it too seriously, being able to be vulnerable, and make new connections and make mistakes. So yeah, those are all some of the things that we talk about.
We were also mentioning brain chemicals and how people can elevate their dopamine by, getting motivated to do something and working towards a goal and completing that goal. And, oxytocin is a bonding hormone. So as people are working in teams or being part of a group art project, like the kids building the Tower Town, there's that bonding element that can come in. And then, serotonin with feeling important and valued, and that they have a place in, making something beautiful that they can share with other people. All of those, I think, are useful tools for kids to learn how to get those brain chemicals going in a positive way versus dopamine hits, because they got likes on a social media app or drugs or other kinds of things. Because we all need those things. It's not like it's really optional. We do need to stimulate our bodies and our brains in ways where we get these good feeling hormones and neurotransmitters, and having positive, healthy ways of creating those lifelong habits to do that. I think in the absence of those, people turn to destructive habits because it's easier. And that can even be just like getting sugar hits, which
Yeah,
can turn into other drugs as you get older.
everything you just mentioned, those are all natural antidepressants. So
Yeah,
even more important to bring those that into the school
yeah.
system.
And
Is
from my experience teaching meditation and the people's development of their intuitive skills and their clairvoyance, when one is being creative, it draws your spirit into your body more, and it helps you be more present as a human on this planet, which is the opposite of depression. Depression is where people can't get their spirit into their body. They're locked out in one way or another, either because they can't ground their body or there's something going on with their crown chakra and they can't access in. And it feels really horrible to feel locked out of your body, where you're like, well, what's the point of even being here? Because I can't really feel alive. I can't really feel present. I'm alive, but I feel dead. So creativity can be a healing balm for that. And, some of it has to do with helping someone get grounded, helping them access brainwave states. I wanted to show you something, and I'll share my screen here. So you've all probably heard of the Eye of Horus, and it's an ancient Egyptian symbol. And I'm gonna go to this one first. So this is a little diagram that I use in my classes. And when I'm teaching people how to meditate, the key thing is to bring your attention into the middle of your head. In the middle of your head, about eyebrow level, is this little white dot right in the middle of someone's brain there. And it's not the pituitary gland that's a little lower. It's not the pineal that's a little farther back. It's this little white spot, and it's actually a neuroanatomical structure called the interthalamic adhesion. So check that out. Look at that for a second. And then we're going to go to, this is a PubMed article from 2019. So this is a government document. And they're talking about the Eye of Horus and its connection with art, medicine, and mythology. And so this is the Eye of Horus. You've probably all seen this before. But what they did is they went and they superimposed it on the brain. So look at that. We can clearly see this Eye of Horus structure. And this is a modern human brain. And this B is the ancient Egyptian description of ancient Egyptian brain that looks more like the Eye of Horus than our modern brain. But even with our modern brain, you can still, clearly see, this structure in
that
there.
is fascinating.
Yeah. And I came across this when I was doing research for my classes. And these different parts of the Eye of Horus actually have to do with different sense organs. So this part is the tongue, the sense of taste. I think this is smell, or maybe over here is smell. The upper part of the eyebrow is thought, and then vision. There we go again. Vision is right here. The eye is like the center of the Eye of Horus is where the visual symbols, stimuli goes in there. So that's actually the interthalamic adhesion, which I don't know, I just think it's fascinating how this thing that we think of as an artistic, symbolic thing actually has some correspondence with brain anatomy. And when you bring your attention into that spot that happens to be the Eye of Horus, it sets your brain waves up so that you can access your intuition. It helps you ground. It helps you bring your energy into your body. it's right at that alpha theta borderline state. So when kids are doing art, they're in a little bit more alpha, which is a little bit faster than theta, but it's still this kind of relaxed, calm state. So anyway, I think that all is fascinating. And I love
That
kind
is
of those interactions between art and science and spirituality, that they're not really separate things. We're just learning how they all fit together. So
wow. Thank you for sharing that, Tahara. I have
yes.
never anything
So
like it before.
so in wrapping this up, anything you want to close with as far as things you'd like people to remember or walk away with regarding your brain on creativity?
Um, I think I would just say to remember to experiment, to disconnect that we're all creative beings and we can support our creativity by giving our bodies and brains time to relax into that alpha state and to facilitate that by taking chances, taking risks, being creative.
Okay, and really developing that neuroplasticity. So you're not stuck in a executive analytical mode or stuck in just an alpha mode. You have a lot of different ways you can use your brain to get the most out of it.
So important.
Yeah.
So important.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Shannon. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. So everyone, I will put in the show notes a link to our conversation we had a couple months ago, the way we talk about art for healing and how art is essential for healing. And if you like this, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you later. Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you, Tahara.